Hello out there. Today we'll be talking about digital single lens reflex cameras. And we'll be talking about some of the important stuff to know when shooting with such camera. Okay, a digital single lens camera, is better than shooting on your phone. Not as fast as shooting on your phone, of course. Um, it's different than shooting with a GoPro camera. Um, and it typically looks somewhat like this. This is a Canon 100D. It's not the best Canon version, but it is a DSLR camera, and it consists of two parts: the house itself and the optical lens. Um, Inside of a camera, there's a shutter that's like a gate, which determines how much time is spent before shooting the picture, how much light is allowed to go into the camera before shooting the picture. And inside the lens is something called an aperture, which is how closed or open the eye is, also meaning how much light is allowed in. And the shutter value will determine how fast you shoot pictures, and thus how blurry or how detailed they become, depending on if something is shot in 1,000th of a second or 1 second. The aperture will also determine detail, but that's depth, based on the f-stop value, the value that it's shot in with an aperture. Like you can shoot with an hawk eye, meaning it will become very detailed, or you can shoot with a less narrow eye, an aperture which is more wide, meaning the eye is more open, catching less detail but getting more light inside. Okay, so that's the camera. When using a camera like this and shooting in darkness, sometimes it's a good idea to use a flash. I have two different flashes, but I forgot to bring one of them. This is the flash I use at parties. It's a bit grotesque. It's a huge one, which you put on top of your camera, and just make sure it's attached, and make sure that you turn it the right way. I use this every weekend when I shoot pictures at Wagen, and you can actually turn the flash in any direction, which is not any direction, but a lot of different directions, meaning you can shoot it directly at the person, bad idea, or you could shoot it up towards the ceiling so it reflects down upon the person again, which is great, because that will mean it gives a soft light instead of a crude light. The flash, which is already part of a DSL camera, is typically not the best one. I'll just show how that looks. This looks like that. This is really bad because this always points forward. Sometimes you see professional or semi-professional photographers using this one, but putting a piece of paper in front of it so it doesn't, brighten the person's face in front too much if we're shooting a portrait. So if you're using this flash, you would probably want to put something in front. I never recommend using these flashes that are automatically born with the camera. Okay, so there's different ways of shooting pictures when using this, and some people just choose the auto function. It's typically the mode is typically an icon of an A plus, saying automatic. That's really the worst way you can shoot pictures if you want to get pictures that are great. Of course, for a beginner, it's a good way to just point and click, and you'll hopefully get something good. But the results are much better if you choose one of the more intelligent modes to shoot. There's also often landscape modes, there's macro modes and so on, but I recommend using 4 different modes. Manual mode, which is not the best way to start if you're a beginner with a DSLR camera, but manual, you decide everything, all settings on your camera. So the manual is icon is typically an M on your camera, and you have a wheel up here where you can set the mode, and you just decide which mode you want. So manual, I rarely shoot in this mode, especially because I often shoot in darkness. So you know, it's gonna be a lot of settings that I need to adjust all the time. Okay, then we have AV, which is aperture value. That's actually, it means aperture value, but most people call it aperture priority. And we have TV, which is shutter priority, and we have P, which is programmed automatic. These three are the ones that you will often be using if you want pictures that are in high quality. The good thing about aperture priority is that you only have to adjust the aperture, that means the eye inside the lens, and everything else, or at least not everything else, but the shutter value, you know, the gate inside the camera will auto adjust. So that means you only have to focus on aperture and not shutter. This is very bad for shooting in darkness, but it's great for getting a lot of depth in your picture. So use this when shooting outdoor, for example, when it's in, you know, the middle of the day or early in the day, but not at night time. On the other hand, shutter priority, the one called TV, actually on Nikon cameras and some Sony cameras, it's called SV, which makes more sense because it should be shutter value. But TV, it automatically adjusts the shutter, which means that it automatically adjusts how much light comes into this gate before it shoots the picture. For example, in 1/10 of a second or in 3 seconds. So it automatically adjusts that value. But instead you have to adjust the aperture. You know, the eye, how open the eye is on the lens. So these are ways where you don't have to, you know, put the setting, adjust the settings for everything. The camera will adjust the other setting as you adjust the one setting. So that's gonna, you know, make some better pictures than just using an auto mode. The programmed automatic is a P on your wheel, and it's the good thing about that is it's almost like automatic, except it makes suggestions to you as to what would be the best values to shoot in. So when you click the camera, it will say beep, and then it will select some values and say these are the values that I suggest shooting in, and then you can actually click to shoot. But this is actually also made to learn how to use the manual mode by just watching what the camera itself suggests. You get an idea of what values would be great for using in manual mode. It's not always the best suggestion it comes with, but it's a much better suggestion than it would do in automatic mode. The good thing about shooting in programmed automatic is also that you can switch the flash on and off. If you're shooting in automatic A+, it will just, you know, turn on the flash if it feels it needs it. But in programmed automatic, you can turn it on and off as you want and just adjust, let's say, the ISO value. So meaning that you don't want to shoot in with flash. If you don't want to shoot that, then you could just pump up the ISO value to shoot in dark locations without using a flash. Okay, so that's just a bit about the camera itself. There are a lot of different settings on a camera, and I'm not gonna go through all of them. Instead, I'll just focus on 3 different things. You can examine white balance yourself, because that's also an important thing. But the 3 things I will be going through is aperture, shutter priority, and aperture, shutter, and ISO. That's going to be the main focus of today. And notice that the files we'll be using today in the camera raw part is located in Tech 08 folder, raw essentials. You can see here you got the ones that's dealing with the Adobe Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw lesson, so they'll be located here. For the files that we'll be using now regarding camera, they are located inside the folder called Camera Settings. There's also an extra folder. This is handed out to me by Andrew Philip Router, which is one of the teachers out here at Multimedia Designers that education, and he gave me this file about putting up the right light for shooting portraits and shooting product pictures and so on. So you can get a lot of information about how to put up light when shooting pictures, and you'll if shooting in a picture, you'll most likely also be using a tripod and so on. So there's a lot of different camera equipment. There's also softbox, you know, a lot of different types of flashes which can be mounted and so on. I'm not going to talk too much. I'm not going to talk about that. But you can read some of putting up the correct stage and lighting for that stage in this document right here. Okay, so, and Andrew Philip Router, who gave me this file, who made this file, also runs the photo studio at UCN. So you can get in contact with him if you want. You can always ask me, how do we get in contact with Andy? And perhaps I'm happy, and I'll tell you. But he runs the photo lab out here at UCN. Okay, so let's get into it. So right now we're dealing with the camera settings. There's a GIF right here. You know, that's the inner part of the house, the camera house, which is located in here. You know, the shutter will be in here, and it does what it shows on this GIF picture. You know, opens and closes to determine the amount of light that is allowed into the camera. Okay, so I also have like a quick summary sheet of what the different what Aperture does, what shutter does, and what ISO does. So you can look at these, and they will be helpful for just remembering. Okay, but instead of focusing on them, I'll just instead open these documents, Aperture, ISO, and shutter. And I think, you know, ISO is probably the easiest thing to deal with. So let's just take that one first. ISO is easy. If you're shooting in very dark locations, you shoot with a high ISO if you don't have a flash. If you're shooting in very bright locations, you shoot with a low ISO. The higher the ISO, the more grainy the picture becomes, because it's actually creating artificial light to brighten up regions that reflect light. So in general, if you shoot with a lower ISO, the picture becomes less noisy, and often you would say of higher quality. That depends on the photographer. Some photographers like this graininess that's attached to a picture with a high ISO, and some associate a high ISO with better quality pictures because they are not as dark, these pictures. They show more detail from the darkness. So it's really a lower ISO is associated with better quality because there's not the graininess in the picture. You can always add graininess later on. But if you shoot with a low ISO, but if you shoot with a high ISO, it will become grainy because it's creating artificial brightness inside of the picture to make the picture brighten up. Okay, so And you can see here on this picture, there's like a spectrometer showing how much graininess is in a picture if you put it to those different ISO values. Of course, if you shoot with high ISO, you don't need a lot of light in the location because you're creating artificial light when shooting. If you shoot with a low ISO value, the picture needs to have a lot of light in the surroundings, otherwise the picture will become very dark. And if you're shooting in very dark areas and you have a low ISO and you have set your camera to use aperture priority, the shutter will, not react positively, because the shutter will try to, shoot it in 3 seconds instead of 1/100th of a second, and then your picture will automatically become very blurry because it's trying to, get as much light as possible given the low ISO value. So it really needs to attract a lot of light before actually shooting the picture, meaning it will have a very slow shutter value. Meaning it will become a blurry picture. Okay, and here is actually just a picture of darkness shot with different ISO values, and you can see if it's the higher the ISO value, the more grainy it becomes, and you can actually see that it's just not chromatic graininess. It's actually also there's color in the noise. And here we see different ISO values for the same shot, and you see that if the ISO value becomes too high, the detail level becomes less visible. So it sounds now like high ISO value is bad. It's not. When shooting party pictures every weekend, I always use high ISO values if I don't use the flash. And when I shoot pictures at concerts, I often do not use my flash because there's a lot of light at the concert, and this light is very ambient, the light on stage when the band is playing. So instead I use a high ISO value to catch the ambience of the event, of the situation, of the lighting in the room. So shooting with high ISO values is not bad. It's often actually creates a very ambient picture, which looks very moody. Whereas a low ISO picture can sometimes seem a bit sterile. And here you see this USB memory stick, or what the if it is, shot at ISO 100 and shot at ISO 1600. So you also see how dark a picture can become if it's shot at a too low ISO value, and it can become too bright if it's shot at a too high ISO value. This is actually something I sometimes struggle with, finding out what is the right ISO value when shooting pictures, because if you're in a room and you walk 3 meters and then suddenly the light changes, suddenly you might want to adjust your ISO value, because suddenly you're standing in an area that is less dark or more dark, and those pictures will be affected if you don't affected negatively if you don't readjust your camera settings. Here you see it as well. Perhaps the ISO 800 here is too bright, and ISO 320 is perhaps better. Depends on how bright you prefer your pictures. I would say the one at the center is probably best, but I would probably just brighten it up a bit afterwards in Camera Raw, in Adobe Camera Raw. Here you see some comparison, and this is just comparisons of what ISO does. You will be adjusting ISO all the time. It's really your best friend, especially if shooting pictures in the dark. Okay, so I think we'll take shutter first. Okay, so this was the gate located in your camera house, and this is actually a picture shot of a camera where the shutter is closing. It's shut at 1,000th of a second, and you know, even though it's shut at 1,000th of a second, that means it's still picture caught in, you know, the moment, and it should really, everything should be not moving at all. But you see that there's actually some blurriness to this this picture, even though it's filmed at 2,000 frames per second. So the shutter really moves fast. And you should know that, because if it can move as fast as 1,000th of a second, then it's faster than, you know, Superman. Yeah, and just one thing, don't ever start, you know, trying to fix your shutter. Don't open your camera and start messing with the parts inside of it. It will not be good. Okay, so here you can see what the difference is between shooting in, you know, different shutter values. For example, 1,000th of a second compared to 1/15th of a second. In this capture right here, you see all the different drops. Each and every drop is highly detailed. I'm not going to zoom in because I know this picture is pixelated. And compared to here, where you see what happens to the water as it's moving, because there's more time for it to move in 1/15th of a second than there is in 1,000th of a second. So you're more really capturing the moment with 1,000th of a second, and it becomes much more detailed than if it was 1/15th of a second. 1/15th of a second is cool if it's a portrait, because people, if you ask them to stand still, it will still become very detailed. But if it's like a shutter speed of 1 second instead of 1/15th of a second, that you will see some parts of the faces of the person seeming a bit, you know, blurry, because the person actually, without knowing it, moves. There's blood pumping through those veins, you know, you move without even thinking that you move. So when shooting pictures of something that is alive, you know, something that lives, has blood pumping through it, a heart that beats, and so on, it's a good idea to shoot with low shutter speeds to get it as detailed as possible. Shooting with low shutter speeds, though, I mean with fast shutter speeds, requires a lot of light. So often you would be shooting in studios to do that, or you would be using a flash. So yeah, that's, otherwise you can almost always shoot with very fast shutter speeds if you're outside in daytime. So it really, but in darkness, you need a flash if you want to shoot with high shutter speeds. Okay, so you can catch something very detailed if shooting with high shutter speeds. So you can try this at home if you have a DSLR camera. You know, you can really get a high amount of detail when shooting very fast, with very fast shutter speeds. This is the opposite. This is when shooting with a slow shutter speed. This is perhaps, I don't know, perhaps shot in 10 seconds. And you can just adjust the camera. You can tell it, you need to shoot this picture in 10 seconds. One thing that's for sure in this picture is, and for sure if you shoot with a shutter value which is like a second or more, is that you need to have a tripod, because your hands will be moving when holding the camera. So you need to put it on something which is not alive, something that is static, a static object, a table, you know, a tripod, something that doesn't move, and then shoot the camera. And you know, because there's a lot of cars running through this picture, they become light that moves, because the shutter registers all the light that comes in, and since the light comes in from the cars that move, well, then it seems like they're just a ray of light moving through the picture. And you can experiment with this. You know, here you see some objects that are quite static and detailed, where others are blurry and moving, and that's because this picture was shot on by putting it on a tripod, for example, and you know, the bridge does not move, but the sky does. So that makes this effect, some things being very detailed and other things being less detailed. And you know, often shooting in a very slow shutter value, in 3 seconds, for example, makes things that are very static, you know, not moving, seem very, very detailed and as having a lot of depth. So you can actually get some high detail level if it's static objects that are not moving. And this is also by using a slow shutter value. You can get pictures like this, because it just registers light, and everything that's totally dark or moving too much while being dark will not be registered in the picture. So that's shutter. Okay, so we have aperture as well. That's the eye I was talking about inside of the lens, and this is a very big lens, a macro lens, which is actually more expensive than all the other camera parts I have. But the eye of the camera determines the depth of the picture, and also, you know, which parts are in focus and not in focus. So when I was talking about this eye, you see this, it's kind of like an eye. If you've watched an old James Bond movie, you'll see an aperture actually opening, and James Bond's come out and shoots. So that's an aperture, and aperture looks like that. But okay, so if we have a low f-stop value, that f/ is called f-stop, and then the value. If we have a low f-stop value, you it's very, you know, that's very great for shooting in general. Low f-stop values are great for shooting in general, and you often use that for portrait photos. It's where you want someone or something right in front of you to become the object of focus. The problem with that is actually you have a hard time controlling the details of the depth inside of the picture, because anything that's, you know, behind the object of focus or in front of the object of focus will become very blurred. So the detail level of those parts will become very blurred, and that's actually okay if you're shooting portrait for photography. So portrait photography often has a low f-stop value. Typically 4.5 is what you aim for often in portrait photography. Not saying that's always what you aim for. I have to be really careful when shooting with this macro lens, because sometimes when I shoot a picture, it becomes very detailed, but then if something is just 5 millimeters more close to me, then that part becomes blurry. So this can actually, a lens like this could shoot the ass of a bee and make it very detailed, or an ant. So if you want something to be in focus and everything else to be blurred, shoot with low f values. And this is, I often shoot with this actually 4.5 value approximately, to get portrait photography. But if you want everything to become very detailed, everything to become highly detailed, you're going to shoot with a small aperture. This is often used for fashion photography, where you want everything to be highly detailed. The problem with a small aperture, a very high f-stop value, is that you need insane amounts of light. So it's because you can see how close the eye is, so you really need a lot of light to be able to shoot that amount of detail in everything. So here we can see how it looks if something is shot with a low f-stop value compared to a high f-stop value. You know, in this case, the object at the top left is very detailed, the object itself, but everything else is just totally blurred. Whereas the f-stop value of 16, you can see that, oh, it's a car in the background, there's houses in the background, so you can actually start seeing what everything is, and you can also see details in the grass in the background and so on. So a high f-stop value really gives you detailed pictures in all the depths of the picture. So yeah, this is an ugly picture. Okay, so this picture we have, that's what I was saying with model photography. Often you want the model just to be in focus, and you see that's what's happened on the left picture, whereas on the right picture the forest in the background is also very detailed, and that makes her stand less out. Perhaps you want that, perhaps it's the surroundings is important to, you know, this whatever message you want to send to the audience. So depends on what you want to be vital in this picture. Okay, so you might guess that this is of course with most likely a low f-stop value, because this is highly detailed in the focus area but blurry. Even some of the drops seem blurry as they go away, as they move into the distance, and you see the guy in the background is very blurry. So this is most likely shot with a low f-stop value, whereas this is the opposite. Everything is so amazingly detailed, so this is most likely shot with a high f-stop value. Yeah. So that's just aperture, shutter, and ISO, how those different settings affect the pictures you shoot on camera. You know, of course, always suggest going out to buy a DSLR camera, but not everyone can afford it. One thing that's really a nice feature on DSLR cameras is that you can actually set it to not just shoot JPEG pictures, but also shoot raw pictures. And you know, you just get a lot more out of raw pictures if shooting professional photography. And we'll actually be talking about some of the good parts about using raw files in the next video you'll be watching after this one. The next video you will be watching is something I recorded 3 years ago, but I just watched it all yesterday, and it still seems like all the things are relevant, and I hope that all the features are still located in the same areas of your raw. If not, you can always contact me. It's a good tutorial in how to work with Adobe Camera Raw and also Bridge. So watch that video when you've had a coffee break for yourself. And yeah, what's left to say is just, you know, cheers out there and have a splendid day. Yeah.